Have you been growing moss in a terrarium and you're starting to notice that it's turning shades of yellow or brown? Before you throw your hands up in the air and toss that moss out, you're going to want to watch this video to hear about the 4 different tips that we have to turn that moss green again. Hey guys, it's Joe here from Hermit Garden. In this video, we're going to go over 4 different things you can do to turn yellow or brown moss green again. We're hoping that using these 4 tips, you're going to be able to turn your moss green again and you won't have to worry about them dying out. It's also going to give you good tips on general maintenance and how to keep your moss green year-round. Tip number 1, you're going to want to check that the water levels are good. While moss does like to have high humidity and high water levels, that doesn't necessarily mean that you can give it as much water as you want. I know it might be really tempting to see that your moss is yellow and want to give it some more water, but it's very easy, especially for beginners, to give moss a little bit too much water, and that can actually be a bad thing. So to check if the water levels are good, the thing you're going to want to do is just have a feel on the moss, just give it a little touch, check if it feels very dry or very soggy, and that will give you an indication of whether or not you're overwatering or underwatering your moss. If your moss is being overwatered, what you're going to have to do is let it dry out a little bit. So you're going to want to open up your terrarium, wipe off any excess condensation that you see, and let that water evaporate from the container naturally over the span of a few hours. If you're noticing that your moss is really dry, the solution should be pretty straightforward. You just got to give it a little bit more water. So just be really careful not to overwater it. Just give it a few spurts of misting, and hopefully your moss will turn green again. Tip number 2. The second thing that you're going to want to check for is the lighting levels in your terrarium or around your moss. Moss tends to prefer to grow in shady, moist areas rather than be exposed completely to the full sun. Within a terrarium, those needs are going to be exaggerated. If your terrarium is being placed next to a windowsill where there's a lot of sunlight coming in, that can easily heat up the terrarium to very hot temperatures that can actually kill your moss off. So if you aren't doing this already, you're going to want to move your terrarium away from any nearby windows just so that they can get a little bit of indirect sunlight instead of being exposed completely to the full sun. Tip number 3, you're going to want to check that you're using the appropriate species of moss. Did you know that there's actually over 20,000 different species of moss? While it's true that most of them will prefer high humidity, high moisture environments with partial sun, there are some exceptions out there. Scotch moss, for example, prefers to be out in the open experiencing full sunlight. Checking your species of moss will give you a better idea of whether or not your terrarium is suitable for its needs that are found in its natural environment. If you're not sure what species of moss you have, you can take some photos and upload it to a public forum like Reddit or some kind of terrarium forum out there to see if they might be able to help you identify it. You can also just Google different species of moss and see which one fits best with your moss's characteristics. Last but not least, tip number 4, switching to distilled water from tap water. It's very common for people to use tap water when watering their moss, but this can actually be harmful to their health. The reason for that being is that moss is really good at absorbing minerals and chemicals. Tap water can have trace amounts of lead that can get sucked up by your moss, causing it to ruin its health. And that could be one of the reasons why you're seeing your moss turn yellow or brown. So if you aren't doing this already, you're going to want to switch to using distilled water when watering your plants. You can easily get to some gallons of distilled water at your local grocery store for just a couple dollars. So now that we've covered the 4 tips, let's go over some maintenance tips to make sure that your terrarium moss is looking green year-round. One of the easiest things that you can check for is the condensation levels throughout the day. If you're looking in your terrarium and you see that the container walls are being covered in condensation all day long, that's a sign that there's too much water in the terrarium. If you see that, that's a sign that you should open it up, let it air out, get some water out of there before you overwater your moss. The other thing that you're going to want to do is to make sure that it's getting appropriate intervals of watering. From my experience, on average, you shouldn't have to water your terrarium more than once every month or so. Any more than that and you risk overwatering your terrarium. I prefer not to think about it in terms of frequency, but I'd like to just check at how the condensation levels are doing as an indicator for when I should actually go in and water my terrarium moss. Okay, once you've done all those things and your moss is still looking brown, then I'm sorry to say that your moss is probably dead at this point. If you're checking it, it smells rotten, it's falling apart, and nothing you do seems to turn it green again, then it's probably best to throw that out just to make sure that the rot doesn't spread to any other moss in your terrarium. So that's it for our 4 tips. I hope that helped you guys out. Thanks for watching. Remember to like the video and subscribe to support the channel. If you want to read more about this, I wrote a whole article on this on my website, hermitgarden.com. I'll leave a link down in the description below in case you guys want to check it out and learn more. Okay, thanks for watching. Bye.